I'm not saying she's dumb, but it's kind of like Dave Rubin. I don't think he's dumb, but I think he's of above average intelligence, but for the position he has, he is not smart enough. Is he dumb? No. Is he smarter than most people? Yes. But is he smart enough for the role he has? No. That's how I think about her.
You can bring up all these different things, how one-sided she is, but what does it have to do with her central intention of creating the paper?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first episode of the Immigrant Show, featuring Rhino Nomad to my left or your right, depending on how you're doing this or if you're dyslexic. My name's Ron from Toronto. I am an immigrant from Toronto to America. My mom was Ugandan. This is Rhino Nomad, also an immigrant to America from the great state of Canada. And his parents are also from Africa. We are here to take your jobs, take your money, climb over whatever walls you build, and have a good time doing it, and have a good, reasonable discussion. Let's get to this.
Definitely.
All right, Rhino.
Yep.
This has been, what, several months in the making?
Definitely. Yeah, it's been a minute. I remember when we first met, it was like a lot more hostile, but now we've talked quite a bit already.
Yeah.
And we've gotten a lot more acquainted, and we found out that we agree on a lot more than we disagree on.
Absolutely. So yeah, I'll give a bit of the backstory as to how we came across. And so the main subject matter of this video is going to be Jalondra Davis, a professor at the University of California, Riverside, who engages in what she refers to, and some others refer to as well, as mermaid studies. So I had made a series of critical videos about this. And when I posted the first one, Rhino had some disagreements with me. And we didn't start off on the greatest of foots. It wasn't brutal, but it wasn't great. But then we decided to move the conversation off of Reddit over to video chat. And we quickly discovered that we agree a lot more on a lot more than might have initially been apparent in our disagreement. And where we disagreed, they were good disagreements. And so I think each one of us has grown rather tired of polarization in media and in cultural, political, ideological talk. And each one of us, I think Rhino will say that he's comfortably on the left and I'm center right. But we're both more than capable of understanding worldviews other than our own. And we wanted to do a show together where we would do that and try to be a part of the solution rather than just constantly bitching about the problem of nonstop toxic polarization in the cultural discourse. So that's where we are. What do you think, Rhino? Anything to add to that?
No, I don't have anything. I think you covered all the bases pretty perfectly. I thought that was a really great summation of how we met. I mean, initially, when you had made the video, and I've seen you a couple times on the subreddit, right? And I've seen a couple
This is
of
the intellectual dark web subreddit.
For reference, it's IDW subreddit, and I've been pretty active on the subreddit trying to engage with some of the comments, because honestly, it's a pretty good place if you're interested in fruitful discussion fruitful discussion with people who have a range of different opinions. So I saw this particular video and I decided to click on it because one, it's a little ridiculous on its face. Someone studying mermaids is facially ridiculous. I think we can get that. Both of us can agree on that, right? However, when I went to read her paper, I realized, oh, okay, there's a little more substance here than what it seemed like in the video. And also watching your video, the Riverside video was the first thing I watched after just the first minute or so of your video. So later I kind of realized, okay, there's more substance here. And then I watched some of your video and kind of disagreed with it. And I wrote a couple comments. And honestly, if I'm being completely honest, I was already kind of hostile to the conversation. Like you said, it wasn't brutal, but it was definitely, passive aggressive. If we're being honest, as passive aggressive as you can be on a subreddit where you discuss politics.
Right. So, and I will say that, I think it's fair to say that you probably kind of initiated the passive aggressiveness, but it was actually largely my fault. Because so when I was making these videos, I ended up putting out 5 of them. And my initial intention was to put out 1 or 2, But each time I was making the video, I just realized there is too much to say, and I need to make this a longer series to do justice to it. And the mistake that I made was that my intention when I was initially making video one was to introduce more balance, but mainly in the second half of the video. But because I realized in making this video that I needed to create new subsequent videos, I made the mistake of forgetting to add that balance. And so, from Nomad's perspective, the balance never came. And so, no wonder he thought I was being unconstructive and bad faith, maybe, because this first video on its own was not very balanced. And that was my mistake. And that's why when we had our first chat, the first thing I said to Rhino was, I think we're going to agree more than you might think. And that's mostly because I made a mistake. And that was what I just said.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, even though I watched the rest of the series and I still have a lot of qualms here and there, I want to be very clear. I overall agree with the argument. Now, personally, I think Jalondra Davis is not a great example of that. I can think of maybe 4 or 5 others who might be a better example for kind of, I don't want to say decadence, but more or less a loss of intellectual, not just intellectual rigor, but kind of a loss of intellectual. Well, yeah, let's just be plain about it. An intellectual rigor in a lot of the humanities. The only thing about Jalondra Davis is that, to me, I think a lot of her conclusions and perspectives are considerably narrow in both implication and scope. Though I think that there are people, specifically people who write about hegemonic masculinity, is probably my favorite punching bag in this arena, who make very large assumptions and make very large assumptions and make very large assertions that don't really make much sense and don't really reflect on the group that they're actually trying to talk about. Right. But that aside, I really do agree with the lack of balance in academia more generally. I think that it is a good thing to point out that, yes, it is mostly left-leaning people. It's mostly people who are pretty far, especially in humanities. I think we might differ on kind of the solutions to this problem, but I definitely agree with the noticing of the problem and the lack of intellectual diversity in these fields.
And so what's funny is, so a slight aside, is that you identify as being quite on the left. Like would you refer to yourself as far left or just comfortably left?
I would say far left. Further left. I would say further left. Now, I want to be honest, I'm not like a communist. I'm not a socialist.
Yeah.
I guess I would be probably closer to socialism, like in terms of my.
So, yeah, because what's funny is each one of us, I think, thinks the other is not as far in the other direction as they themselves think. So my perception of you is like everything I've seen you say suggests that you're moderate left, not far left. And I myself identify as moderate right. But I remember the first time I told you, you actually told me that you felt that I was not as far right as I was saying I was, when I was actually just saying moderate right. So I don't know if maybe you would just agree with me that I'm moderate right, but each one of us, at least at one point or other, thought we were closer to the other than you would think, than we ourselves thought we were based on the labels we ascribe to ourselves.
Right. And I think that's kind of a function of like how political polarization works in this country. It's very, there's kind of everyone has a caricature of what the quote unquote other side thinks. And in my opinion, it's like, if I'm being frank, I would not put you center right at all. I might put you even center left.
Now, amazing. Yeah.
Right. I'm further left of that, further down the spectrum.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, I would, like, a lot of people that I know who might consider themselves even anti-woke or maybe not a fan of identitarian left politics. They are, okay, I should say mainstream identitarian left politics. They are generally they're not as far right as they think they are, right? And I mean, at least from my perception, I don't think so, right? So like I was saying earlier, I mean, there are right wingers that I've met, like actual hardcore, like right wingers, like far right wingers that I've met. I know personally, I'm friends with. For the most part, I think most people are kind of hovering around in that, whatever the amorphous goo that is the center,
Yeah. And so I'm very interested in things like psychology and whatnot. I'm wondering, how, like, it's kind of funny because a lot of the times people who are ideologically kind of very inclined they will make the people who disagree with them, they will perceive them as being, if the person in question is on the left, they will
Right.
view the moderate as being far right, because it's like, well, from their
Right.
perspective, they're way that way, right?
Right.
So
Right.
to them, they
Right.
are. But it's kind of funny. Maybe it's because you and I have a certain kinship and friendship with each other. And so when you're friends with someone, you want to feel close to them. And so each one of us, it's like, instead of you pushing me away, you
Right.
perceive me as coming. It's almost like you're pulling me towards you, or you're perceiving me as being closer to you than I perceive myself to be. And
Right.
meanwhile, I actually perceive you as being closer to me than your self-appointed label would suggest you are.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right. Definitely. 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 And that's a really interesting point. I
and
think
maybe
it's
it's because each one of us is able to see from different moral axiomatic kind of frameworks
Mhm.
and be like, okay, this is where I am. But it's not like I don't understand the train of thought over there. I get it. And like, I personally feel more compelled to this one, but I
Mhm.
understand and respect that one
Mhm.
too.
Mhm.
And because of that, maybe each one of us, since we're able to follow each other's trains of thought
Mhm.
without getting defensive or straw manning, and showing it could, I mean, maybe it creates the impression that we're closer.
Mhm.
And then maybe we actually are. Maybe you're pulling me a little left and I'm pulling you a little right, and we're meeting part way in the middle, sort of.
Mhm. Mhm.
So,
Definitely. Definitely.
and
I
that's
mean,
what the Immigrant Show's about.
right? That's what it's all about, getting a
Yeah.
bunch of people together and like just trying to have more balance and really just see each other's perspective. But I will say, I do think that you might have from what our conversations earlier, and maybe you could speak more to this, you have a unique perspective on being center right, particularly because if I remember correctly, you started out further left or like as an atheist. Again, like you used to be a big fan of
I was, yep. I was a
the
Young Turks fanatic. Cenk Uygur was my hero. I once had a birthday party thrown for me that was themed after Cenk and the Young Turks. This was
Mhm.
back in 2011, and it was one of the best birthday parties I've ever had. It was great.
Definitely.
And yeah, and I was like a strong atheist, secular progressive type. And yeah, absolutely. And so I kind of went through this a similar trajectory as people like Tim Pool and Dave Rubin, although I've come around to the point where I don't think they're being fully honest actors, especially Rubin. I
Definitely.
think they are catering to their new audience that hates the left.
Right.
And so while I went on that trajectory, I think they leaned into it in a way that I have not. And it's
Right.
because I think they've got extrinsic motivating factors that are doing that.
Definitely, definitely, definitely. And it's interesting to hear that. I remember the person who told me that because I kind of had the opposite evolution. So it's like that's why I think we both kind of have a unique perspective.
Yeah, and
Um,
because you kind of were on the right earlier. You were
yeah, I was on
comfortably on the
Reagan.
right.
Yeah, I was definitely a huge conservative. Like I would do like as far as like junior statesman of America. I oftentimes very, very much campaign for conservative values. I was like,
Mhm.
a black conservative. It felt unique. And, the funny thing about conservatives is that the aesthetic of it, I think, the suits of having the moral, quote unquote, moral upstanding, just being more organized, these things kind of appealed to me when I was younger. The kind of conservative ethos of getting your shit together. We can curse, right?
Have a good time, man. Have a good
Right?
fucking time.
Okay, sounds good. So, but yeah, like I was saying, it was just kind of like I like the ethos of it, and then I went to college, and I would say I went through most of college as conservative. I would say really changed me was kind of my transition into becoming a working adult. That's when I was like, okay, yeah, this shit's hard. Like, it's not, a lot of my conservative values. I realized, okay, one, they didn't really resonate with me, and two, it often felt like a lot of the right had started to kind of leave me in a sense.
Hmm.
Like, for example,
That's how I
friends.
felt about the left with me.
Right, right, right. So that's what I'm saying. It's kind of like we have had similar trajectories, kind of in a mirror, like a reflection of each other.
Yeah,
You know?
we kind of did one of these.
Right, right. It just kind of like, yeah, it really just went kind of backwards like that. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
we'll converge.
Yeah, that's what we're doing now. I think we did this and now we're doing this.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. But
But
go ahead.
it may be something for a future video. So guys, a little foreshadowing. One thing I'd love to talk to you about. You recently did Joe Parrish's Intellectual Dark Web series
Yeah.
where you talked about, and this is like very interesting. A
Mm-hmm.
big part of what drove you to move from significantly on the right to being
Mm-hmm.
significantly on the left was
Mm-hmm.
concerns about men's and
It's,
boys' issues. That I
Okay.
don't think is a common experience,
Hmm.
but I
Hmm.
get it. But like as we talked about in private correspondence, I think the thing is it's weird because the right is more inclined towards traditional values,
Hmm.
which means, for example, like men get your shit together, and also there's less, I think, attention to the underdog, and
Right.
so those are two reasons right there why the right might have a pre-existing bias against having too much sympathy for males and who are struggling because one, get your shit together, and two, they're not like the left is more so ideally the ideological side that is most concerned with helping the underdog and making sure nobody falls behind. It's not like the
Okay.
right doesn't care at all, but I think that's much bigger of a priority on the left than the right. So in those ways, it's kind of like, yeah, I can see why the right hasn't taken this issue up too much. But
Mm.
and the left actually is about the underdogs. And some underdogs are males. But the weird thing is though, is that so you'd think that the like when I interviewed Justin Trottier, one like the head of like the biggest movements for men and boys advocacies in Canada, he's on the left. And he actually said himself in our I've got a clip of where I actually made a clip of this. He thinks that the men and boys movement is intrinsically on the left because
Yeah.
one, it's somewhat subversive of traditional values of expecting men to always have it together,
It's
and
not. It's
right,
extremely.
and
Yeah.
two, it's defending one type of underdog. And so I guess the thing is, if anyone's going to go after is going to look after an underdog, it's going to be the left. But the problem is that these days, much of the left, it's almost like it's like a category error to assume that men and boys, as men and boys, could be an underdog.
Right. Right. Right.
Um,
Right. Right. Exactly. Exactly. And it's like, you know, I think it's like I would say the right does care about the men and boys. I also think that they have a distinct problem with actually tackling it from a systemic issue, like from a systemic perspective. But you're right. This is definitely a really good conversation for another day. If you want a primer,
Absolutely,
yeah. If you
yes.
want a
So
primer on like kind of our discuss of this
I would
topic,
love to do that. But
yeah,
yes, yeah, you want to save that? Maybe that can be episode 2.
yeah, that would be perfect. That would be perfect.
It's
I
set.
have no problem doing that. But like, if you want a primer for anyone who's like listening or watching, you definitely check out uh Joe's podcast.
Absolutely.
I think it's
I can
episode
put a link to
5.
that in this video description.
Definitely.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. But so how about to start? So let's start talking about Jalondra Davis and Mermaid studies. So
Mhm.
I'm going to lead in by just sort of saying where my mind was at
Right.
when I first came across Ms. Davis. A lot of people that are going to be viewing this video, they will be familiar with this image. So I'll
Mhm.
just read it out. Hard times create strong people. Strong
Mhm.
people create good times. Good times create weak people, and weak people create hard times. I think this is where much of the Western world is today.
Mhm.
And I think essentially we've had it too good as a nation and as a set of societies for too long. You know, there was that moment during 9/11 where there was a brief moment of sense of vulnerability. And interestingly, people often said that New Yorkers were never nicer to each other than in the week following 9/11. Why? They had a common shared threat and a common shared harrowing experience. But yeah, so I think we're in this pocket. Because before really the Cold War has been over for a while. World War II before that's been over for much longer, obviously. It's been a long time since the Western nations have had a significant existential threat. And
Mhm.
what that has freed us up to do is to not be in a state of national vigilance where there isn't a sense of need to have an hands on deck mentality where the decisions you make for your career like you also like it's not like governments are like actively there's not the sense of urgency to make sure that we have skilled people that can help the war effort, for example. So that frees us up to do more leisurely activities and to engage in vocational directions that are of lower and lower utility to the point where people are studying things like psychology or even worse, like in my opinion, like gender studies. I think these are low utility fields. Not
Mhm.
psychology. So, well, actually, no. Yes, psychology, but not psychology, and more into the more activisty disciplines. I think they lack intellectual rigor. They tend to be highly ideologically biased. The level of scholarship is low. And so you're going to have students paying a lot of money, and the government is actually backing a lot of their loans and grants and scholarships, and they're helping to fund the professors who are making six figures to teach this. Only a nation neck deep in the decadence phase of their cultural life cycle, which is right where I think we are, that's where the "you are here" thing is pointing. Only that kind of country has the luxury to be doing this kind of thing. Whereas, so I don't think it's an accident, for example, that every year Iran, the progressive mecca of Iran, is churning out way more female and engineers than we are, and way more engineers per capita in general. So there's that. But another aspect of having a period of a lack of existential threat to the society is that when we don't have a shared external enemy, it frees us up to bicker with ourselves. When 9/11 is happening, even like people on the left were more likely to be favorable towards George W. Bush than they were a month before 9/11. You know, when that kind of external threat happens, you put your disagreements aside and you come together. We don't have the external threat, and so we're at each other's throats. And what makes it worse, I think, is everybody knows that the university has had a progressively exacerbating leftward tilt. Tilt is too small of a word, to be honest. At this point, it's a leftward. I don't know, much bigger word than tilt. And so there's a few problems with that. One is it's going to foster resentment among people on the right as their tax dollars are going to this to basically fund against their politics and ideology. And it can also create a sense, I think, of arrogance and too much assuredness on the part of people on the left who go to university because they're seeing their esteemed professors give them basically, for the most part, mostly one side of the argument and acting like that's all there is to it. And so that's going to give an overblown sense of confidence in your beliefs, which is going to make the right look really stupid to you. And so you're going to talk down to them and they're going to think you're a bunch of snooty snobs. Not good. And so these are some problems I see. And then I see this video about a professor who is identifying as a mermaid, engaging in mermaid studies. And not only is her university not embarrassed by this, they're actively promoting it. They're bragging about it. So I look into it and I read her paper, one of her papers. You read a few of them. I read one. And in it, I see evolutionary illiteracy. I see historical illiteracy. I even see textual errors by an English professor, like, a professor of professional writing. And the peer reviewers, these are like scholars in the humanities. Like, how are they missing textual errors? And then it was completely ideologically one-sided. And so I see all this and I'm just like, good word. This is among like a top tier exemplar of broader problems as I'm perceiving. And that is what led me to create those videos.
No, no, that's an interesting primer. I guess like that was an interesting primer. I resonate pretty deeply with the feeling of disunity in the country, and I do also resonate with the idea that having struggle tends to bring people together.
Mm-hmm.
I have a slightly different perspective on I guess, the value of that. Personally, I think it's not a bad thing that we are living in a decent enough environment to where we can argue and bicker and actually think about things that are beyond us,
Mm-hmm.
right? Think about like engage. Yes, you are right. There are some like gender studies isn't say as useful to wartime as say someone who's studying ballistic engineering, right? However, I think it's a great thing that we live in a society where there's more peace, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's more prosperity for people to be able to major in these kind of esoteric fields. That being
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's an absolute luxury. And I think if we were to, it's like if you fall ass backwards into $10,000, that's fantastic. It would be even more fantastic if you spent it wisely.
that I understand. However, I think that like I to me maybe it's a kind of a principle objection, but people should be able to be free to spend money on whatever they want, right? They should
Right.
be free to spend money on anything that they see as valuable.
Absolutely.
And if
And
someone sees
yeah.
gender studies as valuable,
Hmm.
right, that is, they should be free to take those courses, right?
Yeah.
I would argue, and I have had this conversation with many other people,
Hmm.
right, that yes, gender studies isn't the most useful degree. No one's going to be high. Very few people, there's very few openings for people in these fields. However, I think a lot of these schools struggle to really prepare these students to be able to monetize some of the skills that they've been given
Hmm.
in some of the critical thinking skills, some of the writing skills, some of
Yeah.
their ability to really communicate, even things like, and this is not just in like, say, gender studies, but also in art, in certain levels of business. You have the same issue where a lot of these students aren't able to have, like, aren't able to like market their own skills or learn to develop a craft that they can market. Even things as
Hmm.
simple as creating a portfolio, right?
Yeah.
Schools
Yeah.
aren't teaching. Now, that being said, I do think that it is a good thing that we live in good enough, prosperous enough times that someone feels comfortable enough to study mermaids, right? And
I
when I
guess,
say study,
yeah. So I agree with that. So, but some of the problems I have, and the thing is, I actually am not anti-gender studies. I think it's an interesting subject matter. I think it becomes a problem though when an entire discipline becomes completely co-opted by one ideological chain. Why can't there be a gender studies where there's a good chunk of the people that are in the field on the left and a good chunk of centrists and a good chunk of people on the right? I think conservatives could offer a lot when it comes to gender studies because they're coming from a different ideological and social perspective. And I think it would be very interesting and useful to our society and wisdom and insight providing if we have an intellectual community and producer of information that provides perspectives from various parts of the spectrum and has them duke it out too.
that would be fantastic, but
Yeah.
conservatives aren't applying.
Hmm.
Conservatives aren't going into gender studies, right? They don't see that, like you said, they don't, like, these are quote unquote low value, low utility
Hmm. Hmm.
fields, right?
Right.
And low utility fields don't really attract people who are looking for utility, which I would presume, based on conservatives' worldview, that
Mm.
that would be what they go to college for, right? So they're probably going to college to learn something. I mean, there's data on how like a lot of people who go into economics majors tend to be more conservative, right? Because these are things that also
Oh,
appeal
but
to,
we talked about this yesterday. There's a lot of people on the left there too. Like it's actually like in a lot
right,
of ways, like economics might be an ideal field because it's pretty balanced.
right. We talked about, yeah, that when it comes to economists, people who actually like who are publishing papers actively in the field, I'm
Yeah.
more or less talking about the students who are
Oh,
coming
okay.
into like
Okay.
economics as a major and using it in business or whatever fields that they get, whatever jobs that they get afterwards. But
Yeah.
my general point is that like these fields don't really appeal to conservatives, and thus you have a self-selecting kind of
Yeah.
cycle.
No, you're right.
And
You're right. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think like you know I guess one of the things that bothered me more or less about the video, about I guess the series of videos, and then kind of like how you explained your mindset going into this
Hmm.
particular paper is the issue of divisiveness. Because to me, like, I think that academia and research in general should be divisive. Like, it should be controversial. It should push the boundaries of how like, when you read these papers, you should expect something that will make you uncomfortable. You should expect
Yeah.
discomfort. You should expect to be confronted with something that you probably disagree with. And there's a lot of things that I have, and I'll be very like frank. I think that when it comes to funding for the humanities, right?
Hmm.
It represents a very small and ever so diminishing slice of the pie. Like I think I linked statistics about this
Hmm.
first conversation. I don't remember the numbers perfectly off the top of my head, but it's
Hmm.
like less than 0.05% of all research
So,
and development funding goes to the humanities, right? Like federal research funding goes to humanities. And I'm not saying
yeah.
necessarily
But so
that,
can I give you a bit of a thought experiment though?
anyway,
So yeah, so I'll start off by agreeing with you a lot of things too. One, it is a good thing that we live in a culture and in a society that is in such a luxurious place internationally speaking, that we can do this. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Two, I agree with you. I think people should have the freedom to study whatever they want, including the most furthest ideologically loaded of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Have a good time. The problem is, though, and you're right, like the level of funding for the humanities at the level of government funding is very mild, very little, right?
I'm not
So,
not just at government funding, even at the university level.
fair enough. Okay, so but like given all that though, what would you think if the humanities disciplines, just for whatever reason, became overrun by Ayn Rand enthusiasts? And so all the social issues programs were
Mm-hmm.
just arch conservative.
Mm-hmm.
Every argument you just said would apply equally well. But like, wouldn't that be a problem? Like that the government
No,
is subsidizing
not at
one
all.
set of worldviews over
Not at
others
all.
consistently. Oh, so
Not at
that
all.
really?
Not at all. Let me explain why.
Okay,
So
because I think that would create resentment.
exactly, it would create resentment, and it would motivate me to become someone who publishes papers in those fields. So that's kind of my, I guess, a little bit of the frustration when it comes to solutions here, is that the solution to me is not less divisive papers, is more papers arguing against those papers,
But then,
right?
but
That's
what happens though when people in the field, when they're overwhelmingly shifted to one side? So you probably heard, for example, recently at the American Anthropological Association at one of their big events, they prevented from happening a speaker event that was going to be talking about the continued legitimacy and need to discuss issues in terms of the sex binary, male and female.
Mhm.
That was prevented from happening on the grounds of transphobia. So what
Right.
happens if the right had huge if people in a certain discipline were overwhelmingly on the right, and then you said, I'm interested in that subject matter, I want to go into it and I want to be that voice in the left, but they won't even let you speak at the conference. And whenever you submit an article for publication, they say, no, we're not publishing this, it's X phobic.
Yeah, let them
So,
speak. Let them
hmm?
speak and let them publish. Let them speak and let them publish.
But
And
what
that,
happens? Yeah, no. But the thing is, what happens when you send an article into the Journal of X Studies,
mhm,
and the three people on the panel that like reviews publications are all strongly on the opposite side of the political spectrum as you, and
mhm.
they reject your paper because it is some sort of offense? Like, how
Well,
do you get
so
in? That's the problem.
so I want to be very clear that
Mhm.
this is a problem that is going to be faced by people who are on the edge of anything. So I do not think that this is unique to
Well,
let me just finish.
yep.
So I think that this is a problem that will be faced by anyone who wants to change anything. That being said, I do think that there is discrimination against people with more conservative points
Mhm.
of view in academia. And I think that is bad. And I want to be very clear. I think that is really terrible. And if it had been the right doing it to people on the
Mhm.
left, I would equally be as concerned. Right.
And yeah.
I think that's a problem. That being said, I think that I've published a paper in undergrad,
Mhm.
and the barrier for entry for a published paper for peer review isn't very high. In fact, I read the paper recently, maybe a couple months ago, deeply embarrassed by it. I was, it was one of those things that I was like, yeah, I'm not. It wasn't the best work, right?
I used to be proud of this thing.
Right. I used to be like, because research papers, I used to read research papers all the time. It used to be
Yeah.
so cool. I felt like I learned a lot. And then I realized, oh, the process, one, I was working for like $15 an hour. My everyone who everyone else's name on the paper was getting paid like actual money, right? And two, I did most of the work for the actual paper, and my name was even listed first. So that was I had a lot of issues, personal and kind of
Mhm.
systemic issues. Well, problems with the system, I should say. But going back to my original point, I think the discrimination against conservative points are not great. That being said, I do think that I think the solution to this is just funding more, increase private funding, but two, also just like a cult, like a shift in putting more attention to conserved campuses, right? Because like the ball is already kind of leaned to one side, and this is true, right? conservatives are fighting an uphill battle when it comes to higher education. I will not disagree with this. That being said, there are conservative leaning institutions. A good example might be the Ulster Academy, the Ulster University, where Richard Lynn works as a sociology professor. Another one might be Hillsdale College. There are institutions that are a little bit more friendly. I mean, Liberty University, they're all institutions that are more interested in conservative ideas and more accepting of conservative points of view. I mean, this is not just to say of like private universities, right? Also, there are public universities that are like Austin is a good example. Texas A&M are also good examples. There are also plenty of more conservative-minded professors at even at Harvard as well. I guess my general point is that there are conservatives there. Sure, they aren't very. Most of them may not be very loud. They might face discrimination because of their point of view and what they believe. However, I think, discrimination aside, I think the solution, and I guess this is kind of a trope at this point, but the solution to bad speech is better speech, right? The solution to bad papers or papers you might disagree with is better papers. And that kind of brings me back to this Jalondra paper, because kind of reading through the paper, I didn't see anything entirely terrible about it. I think some of the points you pointed out were a little bit off base from what I think her intention was. But, I think the solution to, if you really found this paper kind of maybe reprehensible or not done in proper quality, right, is to either A, write a critique, B, write a paper that provides another, or B, write a paper that provides a different point of view on the subject that she's talking about. And okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so a few things. So yeah, before we get to that, one thing a few minutes ago you said about how this the kind of thing I'm talking about having trouble getting in when you're coming from a fringe or minority position. I can't remember your exact words, but like
minority position, yeah. Just if you're trying to do any type of change.
But so here's the thing though with that conference, and I think this is somewhat reflective of similar kinds of things that happen in on campuses sometimes now. This was not a case of like with the American Anthropological Association. It wasn't a case of people on the fringe having trouble getting in. It was people on the fringe preventing people in the mainstream from getting in. It is actually it is a fringe belief right now to act as if the sexual binary is not a relevant concept. So most people are like, yeah, male and female, there is a biological reality to this. It is real and it has an impact. And like males and females are not just blank slates that are imprinted upon exclusively by culture. Right. And so this was not a case of someone like off into the minority having trouble breaking into into like the dance. This was a small fringe preventing the worldview that almost everybody in the world shares from being vocalized. It's in that way, it's the exact opposite.
Right. So I guess my question is why was that person disinvited?
Pardon? No, so their event was not allowed to happen, but they were going to have a speech, like a presentation, a panel, I believe, on the topic of the legitimacy and the need in anthropology to not do away with like the biology of male and female in the research. They would not allow that event to happen. They shut it down before it happened because they were worried that it was transphobic.
Again, I guess my general question is that shows that maybe their belief isn't as fringe as you think it is. Maybe their belief isn't as fringe as you think it is. That's what I'm trying to get at.
No, but the thing is, so what I'm saying though is that this field has become so controlled by people so far in one direction that even people with mainstream beliefs, if they disagree, can't get into the conference.
Okay, there's a difference between, I would say, mainstream beliefs, like just casual everyday laymen who are not part of the field, who are not people in the actual field of anthropology. Now, I'm not sure, I don't know much about anthropology, right? But I think if someone was able to bring a concern that was enough a concern with the speaker that was enough to say, hey, look, maybe this person shouldn't be able to speak here. Now, I want to be very clear. I do not like the idea of people being disinvited or like restricting their speech on campus. Like I think people should, short of like actual neo Nazis, right, or like new people who intend to specifically enact violence against certain groups of people, or just enact violence in any way in general, right? Incite violence, right? I think that there are probably more people that this way of thinking that you're saying is fringe might not be as fringe as you think it is. Like it might
No,
be,
yeah,
yeah,
but
and that's how can something be fringe, like a fringe ideology, right? Yet have the power to completely stop someone from being able to speak on a particular topic. So I just that's the disconnect that I'm having here. Like,
well,
what
because
can you do that
it
gap?
the anthropological community is not that big.
Mhm.
And so if a minority position is overrepresented in a small community, that minority can be a majority in that community. Even though they're a staggering minority beyond that community, they're a majority within it. And so therefore, in this case, they're actually shutting down very mainstream opinions from being discussed because though they are a minority in the broader culture, they have a strong base within this little corner of it.
Exactly, and that's kind of where I'm getting to. Like, it need not to be a mainstream popular opinion because like everyday people don't know anything about anthropology. I don't know anything about anthropology, right? Like other people around me don't know anything about anthropology. Maybe the way that they think about human beings is different than the way you and I, since they are studied anthropologists. So I guess my question, and like I said earlier, I am not a big fan of people being disinvited
Hmm.
from. Actually, I'm not a fan at all of people being
Hmm.
disinvited, right? I think if someone wants to come up with that point of view and talk at an anthropology conference, that person should be allowed to speak. They should have people should be able to ask them questions,
Hmm.
from a podium, just like they do at any Young Americans for Freedom
Hmm.
conference, right? I want to be very, very clear with that. That being said, I think there is a very big difference between like for example, I wouldn't, and this might be an extreme example, but I wouldn't expect someone who believes in young earth creationism
Hmm.
to be able to show up at a biology conference and people not say, well, this is spreading misinformation, this is a problem, not wouldn't hear like qualms within the biology community, right?
Hmm.
And that being said, that is an extreme example, right? I just want to be very clear. I'm just using it to illustrate the point that that he or she or whoever was giving the speech, right?
Hmm.
Who would have been giving the speech, right? She or they wouldn't be able to like their point of view, right? Might not be census within the community or audience that they're trying to appeal to, and thus they were disinvited. So it is like that's kind of brings me back to my point that if you want to have more of more people with her point of view, well, bring in more people with her point of view. Have more people who are interested in anthropology in this way. Be part of the anthropology community. Grow the community. Expand the community. And
Yeah.
I was saying earlier, I don't think conservatives are just interested in these things. I think a
Yeah,
lot of
I think they're not going to be as inclined as a group, and so yeah.
and yeah, and it's not just like being inclined to going towards these fields, but also a lot of conservatives, for various reasons, just seem to go to colleges or get higher education at lower rates than people who aren't conservative or right leaning. Now, that to me is a question of we need to do more outreach in, say, rural communities. We need to
Mm.
do more outreach towards men because men tend to be a little more conservative than women are.
And they're going to school less now than
Going to
women.
school.
Yeah.
Right, right.
And so,
So,
and like, if possible, that part of the reason for that though is the heavy skew that makes some of them feel like, why would I want to subject myself to that?
oh, of course, it's scary, and I will not
Yeah.
discount that. I definitely think that there is skew. You will run up against conflict, right? I was a conservative in college.
Yeah.
I know a little bit about what it's like speaking up in English class,
Mhm.
defending a particular way of thinking, a particular hierarchy, about even just the two parent family, right? And getting not just shouted down, but having like as soon as you talk, everyone's hands go up to rebut whatever you're saying. The teacher
Yeah.
saying that even the teacher saying that I'm wrong or saying that some people just some people just don't get it. That was what, like, an actual quote from a teacher, right? You know, some
Imagine
people,
how much worse it would have been if you were a white guy saying all that same stuff. Like
right,
they
right,
probably pulled their punches a little bit, you know?
right. Maybe, I mean, I went to an HBCU, so like,
Oh yeah,
and
right, right. Oh
yeah, right,
god.
right, right.
Oh shit,
So
so they might have actually gone harder on you because it's almost like you're a race traitor. If
right,
you
right,
know, in some
right. So
regards, yeah.
I mean, yeah, that was kind of the general vibe, but I kept doing it, and I think that's kind of, and maybe this is more or less my own personal gripe, but I think there's a, you know, in your wheel, I guess your
Hmm.
cycle. I don't think liberals or leftists or people in higher education are the only people who study gender studies are the only weak people. I think that also conservatives who fail to have the courage to be shouted down, to have people disagree with their point of view, who fail to be able to have the courage to speak their mind in these
Yeah, yeah.
circumstances are
Yes.
also part of those weak people,
Right,
right?
because that's an example of all it takes for bad to happen is for good people to do nothing. It's like
Right.
if you don't have the conviction and the courage to stand
Mhm.
up when your values are being derogated,
Right, right.
well, yeah, it doesn't really it doesn't really show much of a spine on your
Mhm.
part, and that can happen bilaterally.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, but yeah, so I think we talked about a lot there, and if anyone has any agreements, disagreements, questions, feel free to leave a comment. But want to
Okay.
move on to this video so we can move on to the meat?
Go ahead.
Well, although we've been in meat the whole time, but a new kind of meat, fish.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All right, here we go. So, by the way, audience, this is the University of California Riverside's promotional video discussing one of their professors, Jalondra Davis. You will hear her refer to the crossing merfolk, which she defines. But just
Mm,
to make sure that you catch it, the definition of this concept, it's the crossing merfolk narrative is the notion that when Black African slaves were brought by ship from Africa to the New World, like North America and the Caribbean and such, some of them were thrown overboard by the slavers and or the transporters. And the crossing merfolk narrative is the notion that these Black people became mermaids. Now, one of the issues I discussed in my series of videos is, does she literally believe this? I don't think she does. Nomad doesn't think she does. And she even responded to me in an email, but the email was kind of ambiguous, but like I don't think she does. But the more important thing for me though is not so much that, it's the things I've already discussed, the rigor of and the balance of the education. But anyhow, yeah. So the crossing merfolk narrative, that's what it is. It's the notion, literal or mythological, that Black people thrown into the ocean in the slave trade became mermaids. All right,
mm,
here we go.
It feels magical. It feels meditative. It feels really quiet. It's almost like time slows down. There's just something. There's something about it. My passion for this research came about because I have always loved mermaids. It's always been something I've really identified with. I've always kind of paid attention, looked out for mermaid texts. But for some reason, I never really considered it as an object of scholarly analysis. And now Mermaids is my life's work. Even though my project is about Black mermaids more broadly, one of the things I'm really
Gonna pause for a quick second. So quick thing, if anyone is like just rolling their eyes at the idea of mermaid scholarship, I wanted to say that maybe don't be quite so dismissive so soon, because mythology can show wisdom. And if you doubt that and you're on the right, just think of the last time Jordan Peterson managed to kind of open your eyes up by using Pinocchio or scenes from Breaking Bad or South Park or The Simpsons or Beauty and the Beast or The Lion King. Like there is wisdom in text. So my problem is not that she's talking about lore. And actually one of the points that I readily cede to Nomad happily is that it would be good for us in the West to be more exposed to cultural lore from other cultures, because it can give us new perspectives and therefore new wisdom. Anyhow, I'll continue.
zero in on is this idea of the Middle Passage as the birth of mermaid species. And I call this idea the crossing merfolk. I'm really excited about this unit because we're talking about crossing merfolk, and this is the thrust of my book project. So we have a lot of people feel within Afrofuturism studies and within Black popular culture studies that there's too much trauma, that there's too much pain. So that's like one of the main things that I am interested in, is how Black artists can take this idea that's so full of trauma and pain and violence and brutality as the experience of the Middle Passage, and they can conceptualize it in a way where there's also this connection to rebirth into something magical and something beautiful. So there have been a lot of scholars that have been writing in mermaid studies. However, they've mostly been ignoring Black mermaid lore. Right? And so it's important because one of the things I'm thinking about in this project is that Black people also need access to whimsy. We also need access to fantasy. We also need access to magic. And I just don't think that there's any more awe-inspiring image or idea than that of the mermaid. The early months of the pandemic, I was watching professional mermaid videos, and it was like stress relief. And that's what inspired me. And I've never had time before. I'm gonna do this. So I finally took lessons. So it's like it actually motivated me. I'm still a baby mermaid because I'm still early in this journey. I just learned to swim a few years ago, partly because I have a young child and because I want to be a mermaid. I loved Disney growing up. I loved princesses. I loved fairy tales because for me as a little girl, that was kind of all you had in terms of female-centered, woman-centered stories. And even though there's more options now for young girls to identify with, I still think that it's important that all girls get to see someone who looks like them. The fact that these little girls are seeing it at this age, yeah. And like, how would that expand their capacity for what is possible for them? I'm here for the little Black girls. That's who I'm excited for.
There's a long way to go, and I mean, I always say that representation isn't everything, but representation does matter because it helps to determine the limits of your possibilities.
In the English department here, we have a lot of freedom to kind of focus your courses on what you want to. It's not often that you can find that you get to do that and also get the resources to do the kind of research that you want to do. It's the perfect place to do science fiction and fantasy work. So I focus my history of fantasy and horror course on mermaids. So there's a kind of fun connection of this to The Little Mermaid. I've known that Halle Bailey was cast to be The Little Mermaid for years now because I'm a mermaid freak. But when the trailer came out recently, there was a lot of controversy around her casting. And so there was this woman on Twitter that I follow, and she said, all the Africans y'all threw in the sea, and now y'all surprised a mermaid is Black, right? And so not only did this tweet get viral, Twitter took it down because they said it was offensive, right? And it's like, why is it offensive to state a fact? I think that this crossing merfolk idea, this intersection of mermaids in the Middle Passage, provides a way to think about how you can bear witness to the history, but how you can do it in a way that allows you to experience also some healing as well. There is a whole history of Black people being expert swimmers and being experts within all of these aquatic sports, but getting alienated from that through racial chattel slavery, through segregation.
One of the reasons for keeping people from swimming was because it was an escape route. Because if you're running away, you want to pass through water as often as possible so that the hounds can lose your scent. So if people didn't learn to swim, that made it harder for them to escape. And that's a lot of that within Black history, of having things, of being forcibly disconnected from those things and then trying to put the connection back together yourself.
I think that the mermaid is one of the ways through which to explore and to actually heal that relationship to water.
Y'all remember when the regime changed that?
I can't stop myself.
So deep, so deep.
My unit around the crossing merfolk, which was definitely one of the most powerful teaching experiences I've ever had, because my students are all coming from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and so often what's happening in these texts is artists and authors who are using the mermaid to imagine a way to connect to an ancestral past that was stolen from them, using it as a way to work through a trauma and a violence that they've inherited intergenerationally. And that's something that a lot of my students could identify with.
Thank you, Professor. You're welcome. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, thank you for today's class. It's really, really informative, and just as an Indigenous American who's displaced and trying to reconnect to this stuff, it's really, really emotional.
Oh.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's the meat of it. I thought
Wait, can you let this part play out?
Yeah, sure.
I had a really good class today, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, I appreciate that. Being able to have that level of vulnerability in the classroom while also doing the kind of rigorous analysis of text, that's always one of my objectives. To see the vulnerability help students get to the analysis, and the analysis help them to get to some kind of deeper meaning for themselves personally. It's just, that's it. That's the chef's kiss of teaching. As a faculty member, there just isn't a better possible place for me because of the kind of work and the project that I'm doing.
Good. Yeah, I thought I pulled up the wrong file. I actually created a shorter one. But yeah, well, first off, I just want, you probably saw me doing a thumbs up a few times. One thing that I think people on the right sometimes don't give enough credit to is that I do think representation is, the way she put it is, it's not everything, but it matters. And I recently came across a story where a guy I knew who's an avid, he's very interested in cycling. He was watching the Tour de France with his 5-year-old daughter. And when the men were on, she was paying a bit of attention. But when the women started, when their turn came up, the daughter just glued to the TV, and to the point where even weeks later, she saw a U.S. Postal Service or something like a logo, and she's like, "That's what that rider was, that's and she wasn't talking about one of the men, she's talking about one of the women." And so I do think that people on the right often undercredit the value of representation. So yeah, anyhow, that's the video that got me started, and Nomad too, and then each of us read one of her papers, which I will link in this video description. Nomad read a few more on top of that. But yes, do you wanna kick it off?
Yeah, I guess to me this feels very it's very reminiscent of my time in college. It's very reminiscent of my time in high school when I took college classes. It's just very, I wanted the part to play out where the student was talking about how grateful she was that this class existed. Because I think, regardless of how a lot of people might feel about the ridiculousness of what she does, a lot of, I can see the knee-jerk reaction to watching this and just being like, this is stupid. Why is she being a mermaid? But why are we funding something like this? Why are we putting effort into these school classes, these fields of study? I do think that point of view really discounts the real impact that it can have on someone, especially from a marginalized community. And maybe not even just from a marginalized community, but from a marginalized background. When I say marginalized background, I'm not just talking about someone who is a Black trans person, or someone who has an intersection of all these already kind of popularly thought of marginalized groups. I'm also talking about someone who's just experienced trauma in their life in any shape or form, or any type of who maybe used fiction as a way to kind of escape, right? And sees value in maybe her analysis of the fiction in the class. So I just want to be very clear that there's kind of the way I tend to look at people like her and people who study these fields is that there is still a lot of value, and there are people who still want to learn from her and take her class.
So yeah, like I think I would have a much better opinion if one, there was more balance, but two, if there was not all this evidence of low quality scholarship. So I can give examples. Like for one thing, there was a botching of evolutionary theory. Now I can be criticized to be like, okay, you're taking it too literally. It's like it's not meant to be literal. But on the other hand, so this kind of leads into the question of, does she actually believe the story of the mermaid, Black people becoming mermaids? And some of the people that criticized my video were like, obviously it's allegory, obviously it's mythological.
Yes.
And the thing is, I actually figured it probably was too. But there's a few reasons why I don't think it was as obvious as some of the critics of me said. So one is, okay, in her paper, she repeatedly spoke of not wanting us to put things like science above other ways of knowing. And so by that logic, it's like, well, for one thing is, if and then I think even just like rationality, like that was one of the, the whole like the portrayal of the mainstream ethos is basically white, male, propertied, rational, sovereign, all that kind of stuff, able-bodied, all that kind of stuff. And so, okay, so she doesn't want to put science above other ways of knowing. Well, then if you're going to do that, then how do you avoid the conclusion that every belief is equally valid just so long as somebody believes it? And then she also talks about the importance of using science in conjunction with other ways of knowing. So this could be that. And then she talks about mermaid species. So it was more ambiguous, but like, yeah, I too figured she was using it mythologically, but I wasn't totally sure. But I'm just saying it wasn't so obvious. But that was a problem. So like, okay, so she's getting, like, she referred to, from the books she cited, the idea that mermaids.
Did you get a chance to check out any of the books she referenced in the paper?
No, because like I read her paper and I just figured she would include what was relevant from the books in the paper, right? Because I wasn't critiquing what she was reviewing, I was critiquing her work, right? So I just figured if she cited the parts of the books that were relevant to the case she was making.
Yeah, so, I guess my question, because like I've read the paper too, right? And the paper is really just one long like literary analysis. And I guess did you ever get a chance to take a look at the summary of The Deep or any of the Morpho stories? Did you get a chance to like take a look at the Spark Notes? Anything like
no, I just like, yeah, like I read, like, because I just wanted to review the quality of her paper and her arguments. And so, yeah, I went by what she herself said.
Right. So I guess that, like, therein is my first kind of point of disagreement, is that I feel like if I had, for example, if I had read a literary analysis of Shakespeare, right? Some, like, whatever, Romeo and Juliet or Othello or whatever work of Shakespeare, and I had judged the review or the analysis without looking at the source material, or, I mean, I didn't read the entire book because these are fiction books that are 300, 400 pages long. I didn't get a chance to read them. I did get a chance to read the summary, some of the Spark Notes, read multiple reviews on the book, and get an idea of the plot of, especially The Deep. Especially New Moon's Arms. Especially New Moon's Arms. But I got a chance to read through all of this kind of supplementary text. And one, the book seems pretty interesting. I kind of want to buy the book now. Like,
and you, because you bring a new angle to this, because you have Nigerian descent, and so for you, this lore is it's gonna sing to you in ways that I won't hear because I don't have that cultural background, and so fair enough.
Right. But I think at like a very basic level, I would hesitate to judge a literary analysis without reading the source text, or even just like doing some basic research on the source text. Right. So like, if I read literary analysis of, say, Othello and just did not actually read Othello, right, or did not really take even a cursory glance at what Othello was, as like I'm not even knowing it was a play, right? Like, I think that is pretty crucial to understanding the actual paper. And like, the parts where she talks about evolutionary biology, one, I definitely agree that the science is wrong. Okay, let's be very clear about it. definitely agree the science is wrong. But it is pretty clear to me that the science is meant to be metaphorical or allegorical, right? It is meant to kind of illustrate a way, a framework of thinking, a framework of maybe a way that you could create science fiction. Now, I think the argument here someone might say is that this is not good science fiction, right?
It's kind of like here's an analogy. When Deepak Chopra or some other kind of like woo-woo new age person starts invoking quantum physics and botching it horribly.
Right.
You know?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think that when they botch it horribly, that's like, you know, we know it's not real, right? I think the difference here is that like we also should know pretty evidently and easily that it's not real or correct, right? Like at least reading it, the first thing I thought was, okay, this is not real, it's not real science, but the way of creating a science fiction world around, or well, science fiction world, maybe not the best word, but a way of creating a fantasy around a crossing morphic narrative, right? And functionally, this whole paper just functions as literary analysis, like I said, right? There are things in works of fiction that don't make sense. They can't be explained. Like, you know, if someone writes a literary fiction about Star Wars and then remarks that how does the light know to stop at a certain length instead of just going on to infinity, right? Yeah, yes, you're right. It's crazy. It's fantasy, but it's like that's what it is. It's fiction, and it's meant to be kind of otherworldly and break rules of science. That being said, when it comes to her point about
if you know it's like lore and she's not being literal, well, because I guess a difference with the Deepak Chopra in types, they're not using it as metaphorical, mythological. They're actually trying to say, hey, like our techniques work, and here's the science to back it up. So it's a different thing.
He's very clearly. I also want to clear up one thing. She's very clearly made this about fantasy fiction and lore.
Yeah. So no, I will say, like, in my, because you're right, like to people who think it's obvious, like I don't blame them. Like she uses words like whimsy, lore, narrative throughout. So yeah, fair enough about that. No, but like on the other hand, it's like we're in a culture right now where it's like there are people like, you know, like some males believe they're females, some females believe they're males, some people are otherkin, some people are, you know, like some kids are identifying as cats and insisting upon like having litter boxes in the school bathroom. Like at this point, we're at the point now in our culture where it's no longer as easy to assume that the person is not being fully serious, right? Now I get it. Like at the end of the day, though, I get it. Yeah, like it does look pretty obvious, but like I do have reasons where like I'm like, I think she's being allegorical. I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, but my point is that you don't have to assume. She says very much in the paper. That's kind of like I guess.
I don't know if she did. I don't think she did. Like she said she referred to these things as like lore, but the thing is, not all lore is wrong. In pre-literate times, tribalists were learning things about their environment and how things work all the time. And in a pre-scientific world and in a world without text, they might have put it into story form because that's more easily transmitted person to person, generation to generation. It's lore, but it can also be correct. And so to me, the idea, just because she's saying it's lore, that is not conclusive proof that she doesn't think it's literal. And then she's invoking evolutionary science, and she's never actually saying, this is allegory. Like she's never actually saying, I don't literally believe this. Like even in her email reply to me, she never said, I don't believe this.
No, she said pretty clearly that, well, at least in the paper, she says that it's imaginative. Like when you look at the passages where she brings up evolution, she pretty clearly outlines that.
So was this the paper that I also read?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want me to find the quote or?
Yeah, absolutely.
So she says here, the alternative knowledge source of oral culture and the possibilities of evolution coalesce to form an imaginative rationality that overturns the dominant rationality that transatlantic voyages can only have ended in death for the African people, either literal death in the ocean or the social death of enslavement. So I think I think it's pretty clear cut. Like
yeah. No, and as I did, like in one of my later videos, I did come right out and say, yeah, I do not believe she actually believes this. So fair point. My only is like, right from the get-go, I figured, yeah, she probably doesn't actually believe this, but there was a level of ambiguity where I'm like, I don't want to just take this for granted. But yeah, no. At the end of the day,
Okay,
yeah. Basically, I'm on your side. I think there was more ambiguity than you think there was.
Yeah, I understand. I just like
Yeah. But yeah. But yeah, so but then it's like, okay, so there's so on the issue of low quality scholarship, so there's the botching of evolutionary theory, that's number one. There's textual errors, that's number two, and that managed to get through like not just herself and her editing, but the editors. And then there was her
textual errors. I maybe I forgot what it was in your video.
It was really subtle things. Like it was two cases of referring to a word itself. So for example, when I used to be studying linguistic cognition, I would say as an example of showing that words bear no objective resemblance to their referent, I would say there's nothing apple-ish about apples. If I were to write that, I would put quotes around apple because it disambiguates the sentence because it makes you realize I'm talking about the word itself, not the concept, right? There were two cases in her text where she didn't put quotes around it. Now, this may seem pedantic and trivial.
He can be pedantic. He can be pedantic.
But how is a person with isn't it kind of a bit of a suggestion that the scholarship quality is not that great when a person who's a professor of the humanities doesn't catch the mistake, and then the editors of the journal doesn't catch the mistake? Like, it's not a big deal, but it just goes, it's one more data point on low quality. But the more substantive
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. There were plenty of errors in my paper too that I was. Yeah, so like I'm not surprised.
But that's not that big of a deal. Like that one by itself, it's just one more piece of data, right? She attributed slavery to capitalism. No, slavery is not a byproduct of capitalism. Slavery shares with capitalism a common cultural ancestor, which is agriculture. So now she's botching history and basically archaeology and all that. So she's botched evolution, she's botched history, and she's botched prehistory.
Okay. I guess why is slavery not connected to capitalism in any way?
Slavery was born as such. Slavery essentially did not exist prior to the agricultural revolution, and because if you think about it, it didn't make sense to, because it's like if you're gonna like enlist slaves' help to go forage for you or hunt for you, you have to go with them because they'll run away.
What context is she talking about slavery? Like, is she talking about slavery as like something that has existed everywhere in the world, or is she talking about slavery in the New World as part of the transatlantic?
Like she was linking it to like colonialism and capitalism, and like basically European style capitalism and colonialism. When actually slavery had been it had existed in small little bits here and there. I actually I went and read the relevant passage in, it was like a encyclopedia or like a major British publication, and then I even emailed the professor who wrote the chapter to verify. But like when you think about it, it would be very hard and impractical and unrewarding, unfruitful to have slaves without agriculture, because anything you would get the slave to do, you'd have to go with them because they just run away, right? But if you're going to go with them, you may as well do it yourself, right? But it's like but if you've got a big huge farm, you know, then it's like you're settled, you start developing weapons, and then maybe you can have one person in your tribe with maybe 3 or 4 people with weapons. Maybe you chain the person up to their station, their workstation, and you whip them if they're not doing their work. And now it's like there's actually a lot of benefit because all the work is in a confined area. You're not telling the slave to go away and come back when you find an antelope, right? You know, you're just like, stay in this field, till the grass. If you don't, we're going to beat the shit out of you. It's actually more practical.
This is perfectly fine, but what does that have to do with her paper?
You got the history wrong. She blamed slavery on capitalism when it is not. Like, slavery predated capitalism, so she got her history wrong.
Okay,
low quality scholarship.
Okay, so I guess my point here is that what does that have to do with her paper? Like all the history that you've given me, none of it applies to what she's talking about. Because
no, it does. Because okay, so let
me explain.
Yeah.
Her focus. She's if you look at what she writes about and what she is, and the perspective that she's writing about, is she's a Black feminist ethnic scholar, right? She's not a history professor. She's not writing about the history of slavery. She's not talking about history of slavery. No, she wasn't. Like in the go ahead and in the actual paper, she's not talking about the history of slavery in general, right?
No, but she attributed it to capitalism, and so because she was blaming it on European colonialism. It's like because once again, European colonialism has to be the bad guy.
Right, but she's talking about slavery as something that happened. She's talking about slavery from a Black perspective, right? From a perspective that Black Americans have experienced, right? That's because that is a slavery that's so like you can talk all about different slaves everywhere. You can talk about the Barbary slave trade if you wanted to, the enslavement of Irish people, the mistreatment and colonization of Ireland. You could talk about the colonization of people from different parts of the world, right? And that is perfectly fine, and that belongs in their own context, right? In a place where that is the central focus of the paper. But here she's connecting one second. She's connecting slavery as it happened, as it concerns black feminist writer who's writing about crossing Merfolk, right? To capitalism. And I think you can't really I honestly, I'm just kind of curious, where did like that type of slavery, the chattel slavery that happened in the Americas, that happened around that she would be talking about, right? How is that not related to capitalism? Because at least from everything that I've understood around that, it is. At least
so part of the thing is because it fits into how it's very one-sided. So in her situation, the European white male colonizers, they basically are the sources of oppression here. So we're going to pin slavery on them, even though the agricultural revolution was a multiracial thing where whites were at most a minority in that group, at most, right? And then also, right, and then also in her talk of slavery, there was no talk whatsoever about the black slavers who were selling the slaves to the white colonizers in the New World. So again, completely one-sided. So she's botching history in a way that suits a very particular narrative, her narrative. This is bad quality scholarship. It's ahistorical and it's biased.
I don't think it's either. That's my point. Is that like I think it's okay to be biased. I think we covered that earlier, right? It's okay to be biased. It's okay to be divisive. It's okay to be controversial, and it's okay to only really show one side and not do not show a holistic group of a holistic perspective, right? That being said, I struggle to see, like, you keep bringing up the agricultural revolution. She's not talking about the agricultural revolution.
I know. That's the problem. That's part of the problem.
I know, but like that doesn't have much to do with crossing Merfolk. What does that have to do?
Well, no, but like she's blaming on European colonialists something that predated European colonialists. It's ahistorical. It's wrong. It's ignorant. And that low quality scholarship.
I think she is well aware that slavery existed before. I mean, maybe I can't tell by
nothing in her writing suggests she knows.
Well, I can't tell in this paper, but I think most people know that especially given that people know about most people in America have some relationship with the Christian tradition, and in Christian tradition there were Jewish slaves. Right. So people know, I mean, if you've seen Prince of Egypt, it's pretty popular. Popular culture is very, very, like, if you've seen anything in popular culture, we know that slavery existed before slavery in the 1800s. But I think my main disconnect is that you can bring up all these different things, how one-sided she is. But what does it have to do with her central intention of creating the paper? Like, to me, it sounds like you are asking someone who's writing a physics paper, or maybe not physics, not a great example, but maybe a biology paper, and you're complaining, okay, why aren't they talking about the protons and neutrons that are available to bind to each other in like the bioactive molecules that they're talking about within the paper, right?
Well, if they were botching the science in a way that reflected that they were not showing knowledge of relevant factors, I might complain about that.
Right, but I don't see her, like, you haven't really brought up any way that she botched slavery. She doesn't go in, like, I read the paper. She doesn't go into a deep history of slavery. She doesn't go into an exact historical account of how slavery happened.
Right.
She is very clearly talking about slavery as it relates to Europe.
But she's attributing it to capitalism, to European-born capitalism.
Well,
and
because
nobody's going to call her on it. It's not like there's a conservative person in her faculty who's going to be like, well, wait a second. That's the problem, too, because the bias is likely going to go unchecked. There is a very real chance that my criticism was my critique that I put in those videos. It's entirely possible that my critique will be the most thoroughgoing critique her work ever receives.
this might be true, and because I don't think peer review is very good. But that being said, I also think your critique has nothing to do with her paper. That's my point. Like, I think the point that you're bringing up, yes, you are correct. Slavery did not start with capitalism. I mean, to be honest, capitalism may not, like, if you look at some of the works of economic historians, capitalism isn't something that Adam Smith invented. He kind of just observed what was going on around him, and capitalism kind of was his formulation as to explain what was going on around him. So this is kind of like, just to be very clear, capitalism is more or less, almost kind of it's more or less emergent as time went on. But that's besides the point. My general point is that when I look at what she has said about slavery, and she mentions it about 5 times throughout the entire piece, every single time she is not intending to give a deep, interesting kind of overall history of slavery, right? She is very much not intending to talk about slavery from the perspective of agricultural revolution, how it's transformed history. She specifically also, in many of these places, she specifically called out racial chattel slavery, which is a particular form of slavery that's deeply associated with European colonialism and, some would argue, capitalism. That being said, right, all this being said, I do agree that it's not supposed to be it's not a perfect historical account of slavery. It's not a perfect historical account of capitalism. It's not a perfect historical account of really any of these facts. However, she is talking about slavery as it relates to crossing Merfolk narrative, and the whole point of her writing, of what she's written, is about crossing Merfolk. So I think one thing I just to finish this last point, sorry, I just wanted to say that I think whenever you read these papers, you have to, and this is probably the reason why no one cared about this in peer review, is because to them it's like, one, they probably already understand the perspective she's coming from, but two, it's like
they already understand what, sorry?
They already understand the perspective that she's coming from. She's a Black feminist scholar, but two, they probably already know that she's talking about slavery as it relates to European capitalism, colonialism, whatever you want to call it. And yes, they probably also know that slavery existed before.
So I think I think for the audience, I think I think everyone knows where I'm coming from and where you're coming from here on this. But so so the audience, maybe you're on Nomad's side, maybe you're on my side, no problem. I think we don't need to keep spinning on this though. I'll just give another angle though for why this irked me. As I think I've told you, I used to be a PhD student in cognitive psychology. The reason I left was I saw the writing on the walls. The future prospects of me becoming a professor are very bleak. And there were basically no silver medal jobs that I could have gotten that I would have thought that would satisfy me based on the efforts I'd made. One of my best friends, John Wilder, who I've interviewed on this channel, I met him. He was one of my cohorts at Rutgers, the PhD program. And so he was never, to this day, able to get a tenure track professorship in the cognitive sciences. Now, like, he's a non-tenured instructor in data analytics and such. So he kind of pivoted because he also had a concurrent master's in computer science. I compared his statistics, like his number of publications, his number of citations, the quality of the journals he got published, to Jalondra Davis. He absolutely blew her out of the water. Like, it's embarrassing, right? And so you factor that in, right? Then you factor in the textual errors, the biological ignorance, the historical ignorance, and all this. And it's just like, how is it that someone like this in one of these activist disciplines, like, it is like such a big data point that the standards there are unbelievably low. All you have to do is have the right opinions. You don't have to be right. You don't have to be accurate. You don't have to be historically literate. You don't have to be any of that. You just got to ideally have the right demographics yourself, and then have the right opinions. And you can put in stuff that would be embarrassing for me to hand into the paper and get tenure over it. That was another area of annoyance, because it was just like, I see my friend John spending years trying to get this tenure track position, and it never happened. And I know that would happen to me too. And I've seen it happen to so many others. And then I see this person doing this amateur hour stuff, and she gets tenure. So that also kind of rubbed. You can hear my bitterness right now.
No, I get it. I definitely get it. I would point out that I don't think they're competing against each other, right? I don't think this professor and the person that you brought up that's very highly qualified are competing against each other. So,
But it just shows that, like, it kind of annoys me that she has the same title as, I don't think her work warrants the title of professor. It's nowhere near good enough. And that's not me, like, I guess I am insulting her, but it's like, the thing is that I think the title of professor is such a lofty one. I couldn't do it. And most people who try don't do it. Most people who have PhDs don't become profs because it's so competitive.
Right.
And so to me, it's just like, this is actually an insult to the title of professor,
right.
to have someone so low. And it's not because I'm not saying she's stupid. It's like the best, like where I live, it's like in the best player in Tucson, the best baseball player in Tucson. Just because you're the best player in Tucson, that doesn't mean you belong on a Major League Baseball team. You might still not be anywhere near good enough, because being on a Major League Baseball team, that is high level. And I think professor is high level. And I'm not saying she's dumb, but it's kind of like Dave Rubin. I don't think he's dumb, but I think he's of above average intelligence. But for the position he has, he is not smart enough. Is he dumb? No. Is he smarter than most people? Yes. But is he smart enough for the role he has? No. That's how I think about her.
No, I understand. I guess, like, kind of to ask a question, I'm curious, do you think, is there any example of Black feminist scholars that you know of that could maybe write on this subject better?
No, I don't. I admit that. Like, you might know more about that than me. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because, like, for example, about African lore. So no, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like, that's what is kind of important here, that I don't know anyone that could write about crossing Merkle. This is a very niche field. Like, it's extremely niche. Okay, I didn't even know this was a thing until I read her paper, right? Extremely niche. And I'm sure she's the only professor in the world who studies this particular field.
I don't think she is, though, because, like, well, actually, no, because in her video, she did refer to mermaid studies, which I think implies that she's not the only one there.
It does. I can't imagine.
But she also did say that mermaid scholars tend to ignore Black African lore. So so it's entirely possible that maybe she is one of the few, or maybe the only one that's in that small field that actually takes the corner of that field that represents African mermaid lore. Right. Yeah, she could be alone in that. That's possible.
Right. I guess, like, I understand your frustration.
Yeah.
I definitely think professor is a very high, lofty title, right? And it should be given to people who might be the most deserving. That being said, I kind of feel like it's a lot like comparing two different sports more than it is, because, like, the title is the same, but I think the title is just, well, the title, right? It's kind of just a facially, it's all it is, a title. I do not think that every single professor who has that title professor produces equivalent quality work. I mean, I said that.
That level of paper would get torn apart in a non-activist field.
Okay, wait. Would it get torn apart in, say, maybe an English class or a Black feminist class? Like a class
probably not there, because it would fit the narrative that was on vogue in those sorts of sectors.
Right.
So I guess,
yeah, but I guess my question is, well, that's where it's competing, right? That's like, yes, a physics paper might get torn apart in, like, sorry, an engineering paper might get torn apart in, say, a pure math paper, right? Like, they of course, this is true, right? I think, and that's kind of why I asked the question. If someone was to study, say, was to write about Shakespeare, similarly, or maybe some of the classics like Jane Eyre, are those papers less, like, literary analysis? Those papers, are they less valuable, say, than what she has written? Because I've seen plenty of literary analysis on all of these. Actually, to me, it just reads like what I might read from a college professor about the Scarlet Letter. it sounds kind of the same especially the same type of jargon. The only difference is that it's bringing up kind of racial jargon as well, like racial academic jargon.
And not just racial, they went into the gender stuff too. Like
oh yeah, Scarlet Letter is this is true.
Yeah,
this is true, but Scarlet Letter is kind of like most people who read it because it's like a feminist book or whatever, right?
Okay.
Yeah, they do a lot of feminist analysis. That's why I didn't say gender. But yeah, that being said, I guess to me to discard this particular work and really all of her other papers is kind of to just say that literary analysis isn't very useful. Period.
And also, I wouldn't say literary analysis, like for example, like as I said earlier, like Jordan Peterson has managed to extract good wisdom and disseminate it from various types of, like, you know, the Bible, the Lion King, and Breaking Bad, and so forth. So I'm not against the analysis of literature and other cultural lore. I think it can be very useful, and I think it would be very good to bring the lore of other cultures outside of the Western world. I want to see lore from hunter-gatherer tribes. I want to see lore from Asia, you know, and Africa and the Middle East and so forth. I think and then also have someone who understands it be able to like explain what the perspective it's representing, because it can give you new eyes to see things in a different way. I think it's very useful. But it's like when you have a discipline that I think is demonstrably producing scholarship of low quality, that is very biased, it just, I don't know, to me, it does not live up to the standards of the university. It's doing the students a disservice because they're not learning valuable skills, and the things they're learning are very biased, and that could make them more confident in their knowledge than they should be, because it's not like she's telling her students, I'm giving you a very biased perspective. She's not going to say that. You know what I mean? I think it's a disservice to society, and I think it's an insult to the reputation and the things that the lofty pillar that we put the professorship on. I don't think it lives up to it, and I don't want to bring academia down a peg.
Look what I can do to Mary Worth's smug sense of self-satisfaction. That's right, son. Take it down a peg.
I want to keep it up high, but make sure it deserves to be up there.
Right.
But yeah, no, we should probably wrap it up soon anyway, though.
Yeah, definitely. I want to say I agree with you. Professorship should be taken seriously. Academia should be taken seriously. That being said, I guess my question is, like, what about, say, now I don't know much about Professor Peterson's kind of reading of Pinocchio and all these different myths, but I've read other literary analysis that covers similar topics. That covers, you know, Pinocchio, that might cover Shakespeare, et cetera. Besides the Scarlet Letter. And I guess my hesitation is, like, what about Jordan Peterson's analysis? I've seen like some of his analysis online, but I'm not too familiar with it, to be honest. What about his analysis is better than, say, Jalandra's? I guess you could say to him historical inaccuracy, but like, I guess to me, I don't see Jalondra Davis saying anything like ahistorical. I think she hasn't really made a whole lot of historical points, and Jordan Peterson kind of the same thing when he's analyzing content. He doesn't really make deep historical points, from what I've seen. Now,
in this case, I guess I've already explained why I think she's making historical points, and I think she was doing it basically in a way because it fit the narrative of European white colonists bad. So let's blame slavery on them, even though it existed before them. I won't mention that at all. Just like I won't mention the black slave owners that sent them. I won't mention any of that stuff at all, ever. You know, that was the problem I had. Whereas like Peterson, like one of the things that I think, you know, I've lost a lot of confidence. I don't particularly like him anymore, to be perfectly honest. He was my hero for a few years. I don't watch him anymore. I haven't watched him in 2 or 3 years, and I think he's become incredibly polarized. I think he's become part of the problem that I thought he could have been a huge part of the solution to, which is polarization and a failure for people to understand the other side. One of the things that in his good old days, as I see them, that he pointed out was that it can be very bad when you have people that have unbalanced narratives. So, for example, toxic masculinity, as described by feminists, can be an unbalanced narrative because they will talk about, for example, how most violence is done by men, you know, robberies, wars, all that stuff. What they won't tell you about is that, yes, the person who mugs you, almost definitely a man. but the person who comes and rescues you, also probably a man. That's an unbalanced narrative. Or they'll talk about leadership as always being domineering and oppressive. That can be some kind of leadership, but there's also constructive leadership that makes the group better, where the leader actually teaches the people below them, teaches them how to fish, and so to speak. Unbalanced narratives. I think her narrative was extremely unbalanced in a way that Peterson, back when I held him as a hero, that was one of my favorite things about him. He would always, in his own words, give the devil his due.
I definitely think it was unbalanced.
Yeah, and that's why I've lost interest in him, because he's lost that balance, in my opinion. So, like, it's not like I'm being inconsistent.
I don't think you're being inconsistent.
Yeah.
I just think that, like, you know, you don't need balance in research papers. You need balance across fields, maybe, and maybe across entire fields of study. And like I said earlier, conservatives need to come in and write. You need to write your own paper, like not you specifically, but
No, I would love to see conservative critical theory. I would love to see that kind of thing, because they would have valid points to say. Absolutely. But yeah, maybe we can make that a thing too, about maybe another topic for a future one. So we can talk about the men's issues thing and how it relates to left versus right and their trajectory. Another thing maybe is, what would a conservative social scientist look like, and what could they add? Maybe that could be another one.
Definitely.
But yeah, that's a great one. So this was great, man. Like, you know, we disagree on some things, but hey, like, still friends?
Yeah, of course.
Sweet. Awesome. All right. That wraps up the first episode of The Immigrant Show. If you have any disagreements, comments, leave them in the comment section. You want to come back for more? We want to have you. Like, subscribe, share. If you don't like Nomad's hair, tell him all about it. If you wish I had more hair, tell me all about it. That's it. Peace out. All right. And